Hello, fellow adventurers. This is Dungeon Master Shannon, welcoming you back to another episode of Epic Quests. I decided that I needed to learn how to paint my Dungeons and Dragons miniatures and thought that you would all be interested in learning along with me. Thankfully, I happen to be married to a professional miniature painter. My husband, Robert Solo, is a miniature painter with many years of experience. He's been doing this a long time and has done it professionally and been in competitions. So I asked if he would help me make this video and teach me how to paint miniatures. The two miniatures we decided to paint are actually characters we have together for Dungeons and Dragons. We created a rogue team where I am a half-elf rogue who goes around and robs people, while his dwarf strongman rogue entertains everybody and distracts them. We've had these miniatures for about 5 years, so it's about time that we painted them. So we painted them together and recorded the process for you all to follow along so you can learn D&D Miniature Painting 101. Just to give you a heads up, he's going to go over his some terminology at first, so you know the terms that he's going to be talking about while he teaches. He also discusses his thought process or method that he uses to paint miniatures and that he uses to teach other people to paint miniatures, and it's called the 3 C's. And then he will go over the techniques that we use while we paint the miniatures together. So you get to follow along with the process and learn about the different techniques to do basic tabletop painting for your D&D miniatures. Let's get started.
Tone, relative lightness or darkness of a color. Value scale, a guide to creating a range of tones from light to dark. Shade, a dark tone. Highlight, areas on an object where light is hitting. Contrast, variety and differences which intensify the properties of a miniature. Complementary colors, colors that contrast each other more than any other color, making them look brighter when used together. Focal point, the area of the miniature where the viewer's eye is naturally drawn, typically the face or the weapons of a miniature. The 3 C's. Contrast, a significant jump in value between your colors. Choose at least 3 different tones for each area of the miniature. Choose colors that complement each other for a more striking effect. Control, learn to guide your brush with confidence and master the consistency of your paint. Choose a focal point and make it the key area of attention. Be sure to touch up where your colors may have smudged or spilled on unwanted areas of your miniature. Concept, is their weaponry clean and polished, or rusty and battle-worn? Is their clothing dark and stealthy, or perhaps covered in mystical runes and sigils? Add meaningful touches to your miniature to help tell the story of your character. To prepare the miniatures, I've sprayed them with Rust-Oleum Black Primer, following the instructions on the can. I then overspray them with Rust-Oleum White Primer from directly above. The primer allows the paint to stick better to the miniatures, and the overspray will reveal the natural shadows and highlights on the sculpt. When selecting brushes, choose at least one with a fine point, and at least one bigger brush for painting larger areas. Quality brushes will last longer as long as you take care of them. Any non-absorbent surface will make a decent palette. I prefer a wet palette made from a sponge and parchment paper because it keeps your paint from drying out too quickly. Citadel and Vallejo paints are good quality and easily available. These hobby paints have more pigment, so they cover much better than cheap craft paints. Most areas of a miniature can be finished with 3 steps: the midtone, the highlight, and the shade. I'm going to begin by painting the skin of the dwarf. Here you can see I'm putting down the 3 tones: the shade, the midtone, and the highlight. Shannon is going to start by painting the cloak on her half-elf, so I choose 3 colors and I apply them to the palette. Here we have black, black gray, and a field blue, which is a light blue-gray. Here I illustrate a value scale where I show the tones going from dark to light and how they blend together but still have contrast. Then I do the same with the black and gray. So I start by base coating the dwarf's skin with the mid-tone. I apply multiple thin coats and I apply them in even layers, allowing each one to dry before applying the next coat. Remember to thin your colors with water slightly to keep them smooth and flowing from your brush easily. I speed up the footage so that you don't have to sit and watch me paint the skin for an hour, but it does take a little bit of time to do the base coating. I avoid the areas like the hair and the mustache because I'm going to be painting them a different color, obviously. But don't worry too much at this point if you get a little sloppy, because all the future steps can be used to cover up any mistakes. Now Shannon's going to base coat the cloak using a black gray, which is her mid-tone, for that area. Notice how Shannon tips the miniature sideways so that she can get a better angle in order to paint between the legs and the underside of the cloak. Keep in mind that this is a three-dimensional object, so remember to look at it from every angle in order to completely cover each area. This is what one layer of the mid-tone looks like on the dwarf's skin. Notice it's a little bit patchy. This is why you need multiple thin coats for complete coverage. In order to keep the layer nice and smooth, try not to overwork the paint. Just apply one thin layer and let it completely dry. This is what 2 or 3 nice thin layers looks like for the mid-tone of the dwarf's flesh. So now I'll move into the shade. Consistency of the paint is very important for a nice smooth finish, so I add a drop of water with the end of my brush. Notice how the paint flows nice and smoothly off of the bristles. With a shade, try to keep the shadows on the recessed areas and the underside of limbs and objects. On the dwarf here, notice I'm painting under his pectorals, under his arms, under his chin, inside of his hands, anywhere a shadow would be if the light was shining from above. If you paid attention during the priming stage, the shadows will be anywhere that the white primer did not reach. I continue shading, so I speed it up again for you. A great technique for shading is called a wash. First grab some water, put it on your palette, then take your shade and mix them together until you get a nice, watery, flowing consistency. The reason a wash is such a great technique is because it naturally flows into the cracks and crevices and the most recessed areas of the miniature. I apply the wash to the entire area of the skin, allowing the thin consistency to flow into those deeper areas. If you notice any small bubbles appear, just pop them with your brush and try to prevent the wash from pooling up too much. Here's the result of the skin after the shading. Using black as her shade, Shannon takes the same approach and works on her cloak. She focuses on the folds and the deep recesses of the cloak. And here are the results. Following the same steps, Shannon makes a black wash and applies it to the entire cloak. The black cloak on her half-elf rogue is starting to look really good. After your shade color is dry, reclaim the mid-tone by covering areas where a shadow looks unnatural. Leave the shade color only in those creases, folds, and the undersides of each area. Shannon does the same thing on her cloak with the mid-tone black-gray. Now we begin highlighting. If you feel like your brightest tone has too much contrast, you can mix your highest tone in with your mid-tone. With this highlight, focus on the smaller areas of the mid-tones which are on the very top of each part. Leave the shaded areas dark and leave most of the mid-tone there also. Concentrate on areas like the top of the shoulders, arms, and head. The brow and the bridge of the face and cheekbones also need to be highlighted. Here are the results of that highlight. Now I take my lightest tone and I apply the final highlight. Here I focus on an even smaller area on top of the previous highlight. Place these most extreme highlights on your focal point, in this case, the face of the dwarf. Following the exact same process, we select 3 tones for each area. Shannon moves on to paint the fair skin of her half-elf. Again, using the same 3-step process, I paint the mid-tone of the dwarf's pants, in this case light gray. For the shade on the dwarf's pants, I use field gray, which is a blue-gray. The highlight is white. I start preparing a clean palette for the next steps. I've decided to paint blue stripes on the dwarf's white pants, and Shannon is going to paint the dress of her half-elf a pale green. In the same way as before, we choose 3 tones for each area. If your tone is either too light or too dark, you can mix the colors together. To go along with the concept of my character, my dwarf rogue is part of a traveling circus. As a circus strongman, he has bright and flashy striped pants. To achieve this look, I carefully block out the blue lines, making sure to leave enough space in between each line. Painting something like this can be a challenge, so feel free to look at pictures online for inspiration. Don't be afraid to mess up the work you've already done, because it's easy enough to cover the mistake with the previous color. I actually did make one of the lines on the back of his pants too thick, but it was a simple fix, as I just took the gray tones and corrected the thickness of the line. Now Shannon paints the dress. At this stage, it's important to be very careful with your brush. Try not to slop on the finished areas that you've just completed. Notice how she turns the miniature again and faces the area she's working on directly towards her. This allows her to put the brush in those hard to reach places. Now Shannon does a green wash. After the wash, you can see the finished result. Now I paint the dwarf's hair. To paint blonde hair, I use tan yellow and I give it a golden yellow wash. To highlight the hair, I mix tan yellow with pale sand. Shannon wants her half-elf to have red hair. She starts with a golden yellow base coat and then applies an orange wash. A second wash is applied to shade the hair a bit further towards a natural-looking red. This was done with an orange-brown. The next area that Shannon paints is the sword. She starts with a dark metallic gray and applies a base coat to the entire area. To highlight the sword, she uses silver. With metallic paints, it's important to add a little bit of water to keep the paint flowing nice and smooth. If you're not careful, it has a tendency to get a little bit chunky and thick. When applying highlights to something like a sharp sword, use the edge of your brush rather than the tip of the bristles and drag it gently across the edge. Next, highlight the edge of the blade, which is facing towards the top. To paint the leather on the half-elf and the dwarf, we use the same process, this time using a reddish brown as the mid-tone. A very dark brown is then mixed as a wash and applied to every area of the leather. To highlight the leather, tan yellow was added to the red brown and applied just to those raised edges and the tops of each area. With just a few finishing touches remaining, we focus now on the base. For this step, we use a stone gray and a dark green, along with the dark brown that we used on the leather. First, we take the dark brown and cover the entire base. Once dry, I applied the dark green wash. Next, I dry brush stone gray onto the base. To dry brush, load your brush with the paint and then wipe away most of it on a dry paper towel, leaving just a little bit of pigment on the brush. With this dry brush, lightly sweep the bristles across the base. Only the raised areas will be highlighted. All that's left to do is to paint the base black and the model is finished.
So there you have it. The amazing Zog and Alana Moonblossom have been painted. Our D&D characters, we can now use them for our next D&D campaign that we play together. Remember that having miniatures and having them painted really livens up your Dungeons & Dragons experience, and I hope that this video helped you learn how to do it yourself. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and I'll make sure to pass any on to Robert that need to be answered. And, thanks for tuning in and following Kirkwood Public Library, and I will see you the next time that we go on an epic quest together.